Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Today we talk politics, both overseas and down on the farm. In the second half of our show, Angela Logomassini, CEI Senior Fellow in Environmental Risk, Regulation, and Consumer Freedom, digs into the just-announced national strategy to promote the health of honeybees being formulated by no fewer than 16 federal departments and agencies. Up first, joining us via Skype from London, we're pleased to welcome Matt Sinclair, Senior Consultant at Europe Economics. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Matt, the UK just came through what many are calling a watershed election. Give us some insight on the contending parties, the winners, the losers, and the surprises.
I think it's been one of the most remarkable elections in decades in the UK. We had a result which no one credible was expecting. There was no one, at least in public, so many people have claimed since that their private information says something different, but no one in public predicted that there would be anything other than a close-run thing between the Conservative Party, the main centre-right party, and the Labour Party, the main centre-left party, with neither able to form a majority in the House of Commons and therefore able to form a government without going begging to the minor parties.
So, Matt, didn't the Conservatives rule in a coalition government previously?
So the Conservatives had been in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats over the last Parliament, so from 2010 to 2015. Now they're going to have an overall majority and they'll be able to rule on their own, which in a winner-takes-all political system like we have in the UK is enormously important.
And what happened to the Liberal Democrats?
The Liberal Democrats collapsed. People were expecting they'd fall from about 60 seats to about 30 seats. Instead, they fell to 8 seats. Really a catastrophic result from them, which it will take them a long time to recover from, if they ever do.
And is there a good explanation for that?
They fell apart, it seems, really because they lost the trust. They ran on things like scrapping student fees and then voted for increasing them. And whatever people thought of the merits of that issue, I think they just came to the view that the Liberal Democrats couldn't be trusted. They'd always been a party which had done well out of being the opposition, out of not being the two main parties. Once they were in government, they had to run on their record. People didn't trust them, and because they didn't trust them, they didn't get the credit that the Conservatives appear to have got for the economy recovering, for Britain's broadly getting back on track.
And there was a big surprise from the Scottish National Party. What happened there?
It was really an earthquake north of the border in Scotland. The Labour Party has dominated Scottish politics now for decades, and that's been its traditional heartland. Traditionally, it was very hard for the Conservatives to win because Labour always had that big additional number of Scottish seats. So the Conservatives needed to win a big majority in England to make up for the fact they had much less representation in Scotland. Now, all of that's been wiped away, and almost all of the seats, all but 3 of the seats in Scotland, are now held by the Scottish National Party. So they are now the 3rd biggest party in Westminster, and they dominate Scottish politics.
And isn't this kind of strange, given that the Scottish independence referendum last year failed? So how is it that the SNP, whose anchor platform is Scottish independence, surged so strongly?
Many commentators expected that the Scottish National Party would fall back after their side lost in the referendum on Scotland becoming independent. What seems to have happened instead is that referendum united those who want an independent Scotland under the SNP banner and convinced some other Scots who didn't really like the Scottish Labour Party that they could vote for the SNP, who they prefer as representatives for Scotland within the UK, and given the referendum result, they'd be safe from the consequence of Scottish independence. So it seems to have, in a number of ways, actually helped the party when many people were really expecting they would suffer after that independence referendum.
Is this going to cause a major devolution of power closer to home for the Scots?
Everyone expects a major devolution of power in the UK. Now, it's important to understand UK politics and the power in UK politics and the purse has been incredibly centralised for a very long time. So particularly in England, decisions are made much more than in the United States or even other parliamentary systems like Canada at the centre in Westminster.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to see more powers devolved to Scotland, which already has an enormous range of powers vested in the Edinburgh Parliament, but we're also going to see considerable devolution within England, starting with what the government are calling the Northern Powerhouse, which is a number of northern cities, Manchester, for example, which are going to be given more ability to run their own affairs.
As the Scots begin running their own affairs, are they also going to become more responsible for their own fiscal house, or are they going to have to rely on money coming from the south?
In theory, Scotland, as it gains more political powers, is going to have more authority over and more responsibility for raising the revenue to pay for all of its spending programs.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, though, Scotland can't do that. The fiscal case underpinning Scottish independence always depended on the revenues from North Sea oil. Now, North Sea oil is in long-term decline.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a phenomenally productive oil field over the years, but it's in decline, and the future fossil fuel resources of the UK, shale gas and that, are largely located in the north and south of England. So Scotland is going to have enormous problems financing all this, and I think that means that in reality, while both sides may like the idea of Scotland financing its own spending in theory, there's no way they're actually going to make the pretty drastic cuts in public spending per capita, which would be needed for all that to add up.
So rounding out the parties that were in the news, a fellow named Nigel Farage from UKIP, the UK Independence Party, made a lot of noise before the election and seems to have disappeared. What happened to them?
UKIP suffered from the problem that small parties normally face in British politics, and indeed third parties do in American politics, which is it's a first-past-the-post electoral system. In each individual seat, there is no prize at all for second place. And that's a system which is designed to encourage people to form broad, inclusive parties and coalitions before an election, go to an election as in big party groups, and then voters can give their verdicts. We don't have this system that exists in other European countries where you have loads of little parties, each getting a little share of the vote, and then forming coalitions afterwards. That's much rarer in the UK. And so we have an electoral system that punishes parties that try to do what UKIP does. They have been punished. They got only one seat. They actually went backwards from 2 seats to 2 defectors they had in the last parliament. So UKIP really has had a very bad result, despite attracting quite a few votes. And it will obviously depend on what happens in the next parliament. But it's entirely possible that they peaked. It's entirely possible that UKIP are going to start going to decline. Indeed, they've had some quite ugly internal battles since the election concluded. We'll see. I mean, one thing we've learned in the last couple of weeks is be careful about predicting anything in British politics. But it does seem like UKIP have had a very bad election, and they might struggle to keep up that momentum they've been generating beforehand. The Conservative Party is looking much more confident as a representative for centre-right voters.
Well, speaking of which, with a strong mandate behind him and no need to form a coalition, can David Cameron propel the kind of changes that Margaret Thatcher once did?
He could. I'm not sure he wants to. I think there's 2 important differences. The first is that David Cameron is taking over a UK which is doing broadly pretty well. I don't mean that there aren't plenty of things which could use a fix, plenty of strategic problems which need to be addressed. But the British industry, for example, is quite competitive. The British economy has grown faster than its peers over the last few decades. Cameron exists after Thatcher. And I think the other side to it is he, in his personality, doesn't have the taste for robust politics that Thatcher did. People massively overstate how much the Liberal Democrats were really the moderating influence in the last Parliament. Cameron himself is really a moderate politician. He's a moderate politician, conservative of the centre-right, and expecting that now he's free, he's just been dying to be a great Thatcherite reformer would be a mistake. However, there are some areas where reforms have been more ambitious. Education, where we've had a considerable liberalisation to create more, sort of similar to US charter schools, more free schools. And welfare, where there have been some quite dramatic changes to simplify, reform, and improve incentives within the benefits system.
Well, your description of Margaret Thatcher as having a taste for robust politics is such a British way of putting it.
Sure. I mean, she was once talking about some European political leaders who hadn't been up for some foreign policy confrontation. She said, they're a weak lot in Europe. Weak. It's not the kind of thing you could ever imagine David Cameron saying.
So, Matt, let's broaden it out a little bit to what's going on in Europe, and let's also broaden it out and look at things historically. If you study the fall of the Roman Empire, two factors stand out. One is the constant military conflicts in what is now Syria and Iraq, with, ever-present threats by the Persians. And the second is the inability of the Roman provinces to assimilate the large influx of Goth, Vandal, and Hun immigrants who eventually rose up and sacked Rome. Is history repeating itself in Europe with Islamic fundamentalists playing the role of the barbarians?
I don't think so. I think the European economies are much more vulnerable to their own economic dysfunction than they are to anything like the kind of physical onslaught that affects the Roman Empire. I'm not a scholar of that era, but I think one of the things to understand, of course, is that the immigrant populations to Europe are going there looking to live and do better and prosper in European society. It's not true of all of them, but it's true of enough that I think if Europe can offer them a self-confident, prosperous society in which to integrate, then I think they'll do so. I think the danger is if these people flee very dysfunctional societies and arrive at European societies which are both hateful of their own traditions and so economically dysfunctional that these people get left at the economic margins where resentments and anger fester. I think when you've got economies with very high unemployment, where you've got inflexible labour markets, which means it's very hard for people to build a career, I think that means you're less likely to get the better side of immigration. You're likely to get a lot more of the worst side of it. I think the real problem the European economies are facing is the structural weakness of some of their economies, particularly, across Western and Southern Europe, really. I mean, Southern Europe is where it's most obvious today, but I think there are some sort of lasting dysfunctions in Western Europe as well. And if you fix that, I think you will address some of the problems that are coming up from people migrating from societies which have very deep problems of their own, people coming over from bringing some of those problems with them. I think it's sort of the jury's out on whether that's going to be the fall of the Roman Empire or when people were first migrating to the US, they brought all sorts of cultural problems with them. It took a long time for all those problems, all of the ugliness of machine politics in the early United States coming out of inheritances from the countries people had brought with them. It took a long time for this to work out, but they did in the end because the US had a strong political culture to which they could try and integrate, and it had the economic success, which meant that it wasn't all a zero-sum game. But if the European economies are in chronic decline and all there is zero-sum political fighting over what's left, then I think that's not going to create very good incentives.
So speaking of decline and trouble in the southern sector, whether or not Greece is actually forced out of the EU, it's hard to see how much longer they can cling to the euro as bankruptcy looms and the prospects for further bailouts dim. What would the impact of a Greek default be in the EU and on the UK's relationship with the EU?
One thing to understand is Greece is very small. The really important question is Spain and Italy and maybe somewhat less so France. One of the reasons why the European authorities are playing hardball with Greece is that they don't want to encourage Spain to do the same thing. And if Spain does the same thing, maybe Italy. Greece leaving could strengthen the Eurozone because the Eurozone is then able to work on a more stable set of countries, a set of countries which is more likely to be able to work. It could weaken it, on the other hand, if it leaves. Is seen to have done well by leaving, and that encourages Spain or Italy to do the same thing.
Yeah, the odds of that are pretty small unless they really change their labor and economic policies there.
I think what you could probably expect to happen is that Greece has a terrible collapse when it leaves the Eurozone, as its banks get in trouble and all kinds of related problems to that. But then, a couple of years down the line, from a much lower base, it starts to have some pretty respectable growth figures. The danger for the Eurozone then will be if Spanish voters, looking at terrible youth unemployment and with limited information about what's really going on in Greece, draw the conclusion that maybe the grass is greener on the outside. I think that's the real danger to the Eurozone, more than some of the financial contagion people are talking about. Greece just isn't big enough for the financial contagion to be that large.
Speaking of the grass being greener on the other side, the Conservative Party is committed to a referendum on the UK staying in the European Union. When is this likely to happen?
The referendum is supposed to happen in 2017. There's now talk it might be brought forward, possibly even to sometime in 2016. Now, that's presumably because the party wants to get it out and over and done with plenty of time till the next election.
Do you think it's going to be a hard-fought battle and a close vote?
I would expect a close vote on whether the UK leaves the EU. It's possible it could break in either direction. I don't think there's a lot of evidence we have to go on what the final vote would be. The polls have been close and moving against leaving the EU, but I think those polls aren't going to be very meaningful until we actually get into the campaign and people see it unfolding and start to really think about the issue. My expectation would be for a close vote. I don't have a strong view on whether we'll stay in or leave. I think that would be much more likely if we'd be much more likely to leave if the referendum took place in the early 2020s.
Is a hard-fought campaign and a potential close vote on leaving the European Union likely to spur perhaps a renegotiation on the nature of the Union?
The government's plan is to try and renegotiate the UK's relationship with the EU and then have a referendum on the renegotiated settlement. It seems very unlikely that the renegotiation will lead to fundamental changes in the relationship between the UK and the EU. All the signs we've had from European leaders is that they wouldn't accept that. They need more integrated EU in order to protect the Eurozone, which is very vulnerable to asymmetric shocks affecting one part of the Eurozone. It can't accommodate them very easily within that monetary structure. So it seems unlikely that will change very much. However, the question will be, will enough seem to have changed to convince British voters to give that new relationship a chance, maybe, and support staying in because of that renegotiation?
Looking more broadly at economic policy, let's talk about energy policy a bit. I know that's a subject you follow quite closely and the source of a great deal of economic upheaval in Europe. You know, putting aside the global warming debate itself, let's not go there.
Yeah.
But even so, how long can this headlong rush to decarbonize last before European citizens revolt at being impoverished while shivering in the dark?
UK energy policy has been a pretty thorough disaster. We're trying to invest about £200 billion in the energy sector alone in order to meet environmental targets. Paying for all of that investment requires higher profits in the sector. Paying for those profits requires higher prices for consumers. That's hurting industrial consumers, and you're seeing sectors like aluminium have collapsed in the face of rising energy prices. It also means higher prices for residential consumers who have seen enormous increases in their energy bills, in large part driven by government policy.
Well, this is happening not just in the UK, it's happening all across Europe. I mean, look at Germany right now.
The UK is probably the most extreme example. Germany has high renewable energy costs, but it doesn't have some of the other policies we have, like what's called the floor under the carbon price in the European carbon market. So Britain doesn't just have cap and trade for emissions, which all the European economies have. We have cap and trade and special price fixing to make sure cap and trade is sufficiently expensive for the tastes of those worried about climate change.
Well, if you look at green energy, windmills and solar are intermittent energy sources. And of course, electricity needs to be used almost instantaneously when you're working at the scale of a national power grid. What's the plan for providing baseload capacity if traditional fossil fuels are shut down?
Well, what's happened is that we've gone from having one of the most liberalized energy markets in the world to having one which is dominated by political decision-making. So even fossil fuel plants now can't work without subsidy. The whole system is too broken now to work on the basis of a free market structure. So what they're having to do is institute new capacity payments to make sure there's enough reliable supply on the grid that it doesn't collapse in the many occasions where you have high demand for energy but not a lot of wind. That just adds to the cost to consumers, makes it even more of a burden, and makes the whole system much less efficient.
It sounds like the UK national energy system is heading the same place as the California water system.
It's in an enormous mess, but I think one of the problems is these rising costs don't necessarily lead to demands for reversal of the policy. I think this is something American audiences need to bear in mind, is that just because the policy is failing to achieve much, and just because the policy is very expensive, doesn't mean it gets reversed. Because what people do, and understandably I think, is they look at the sector and they say, okay, energy company profits are rising, the prices I'm paying are rising, and they come to the reasonable conclusion that the reason they're paying more is because energy companies are profiteering. The reality is that profits are rising because the volume of investment is rising. Those profits are a return. There's not an increase really in margins, it's an increase in the massive volumes of investment needed in things like offshore wind farms. The result is people get angry and they demand price caps. They demand windfall taxes, and indeed the Labour government was running on capping energy prices. So what you might get is another bad intervention rather than reversing the bad intervention that caused all these problems.
Well, who is actually profiting most from these green energy policies?
It's creating enormous profits in the energy sector, but I don't think it's really doing the energy sector very much good, because it's creating a huge political backlash against the energy firms. So the same politicians, exactly the same people, will, on the one hand, demand an enormous increase in investment. They'll then, when that leads to a rise in profits and a rise in prices, they'll attack this as an awful result of profiteering in the privatized energy sector. And, you know, you can't expect consistency from politicians. And the end result is that I don't think anyone really benefits in anything but the short term. Unless you're really thinking in the very short term, even the energy sector doesn't really benefit. The profits pile up to renewable generators, but I think the sector is going to pay a price in the longer term as the political pressure for a backlash continues to build.
You know, after the sweeping conservative electoral victory, is there an opportunity to change course here on energy policy?
Unfortunately, energy policy is one of the areas where the current conservative leadership is the worst, where they are furthest from the kind of free market policies which one might have associated with Margaret Thatcher, to come back to your earlier question. And they've just appointed a new climate change minister who is very much an advocate for the current direction of UK climate policy. We might see some small reverses on things like onshore wind farms, which are quite unpopular in aesthetic terms as well. But I don't think we're going to see much of a change in the overall direction of policy for now. They're going to try and push through and just hope that they can keep the show on the road until another government has to deal with the deeper problems in UK energy policy.
So, Matt, give us a forecast of what lies ahead for the UK in the medium term.
I think in the medium term, we can be quite optimistic about the future for the UK. Our fundamentals are very strong. We've still got a lot of the policy results, the flexible labour market, the competitive markets more generally that came out of the Thatcher revolution. We've got strengths in a number of very valuable sectors going forward. Even old laggards like the UK car industry are doing incredibly well at the moment. I think we can be very optimistic about how the UK is doing. And thankfully, we avoided the catastrophe of what was the most left-wing Labour government since the Labour Party since the early 1980s, coming to power and forming a government. So we avoided falling into that pit hole. And I think the UK could actually do very, very well, in spite of some of its mistakes in areas like energy policy. Because the one thing we're fortunate in is that everyone else is making plenty of their own mistakes as well.
Well, Matt, thanks so much for filling us in on what's going on that side of the pond. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
That was Matt Sinclair with Europe Economics here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, Angela Logo-Massini from CEI looks into the latest environmental scare that's put bees in Washington's bonnet. Stay tuned.